Well, this is our third page of notes for the French Revolution. This is our last page as well, so we'll be doing our test on Monday. So please study your notes. Again, make sure to read the sections as you do those assignments. And quizzes is also available. You can do those in preparation, so good luck on that. So today's page is titled Napoleon's Conquest of Europe, and it looks like we'll go to 26. Hopefully you've already written these down before watching this. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. Today it's a French island in the Mediterranean. By the 1790s, people in France were tired of war, revolution, all of the violence that was taking place, and they were also impatient with the weak directory, which was their form of government at that time. Napoleon was sent to military school, and kind of through some chance events, he kind of quickly rose to power in the French military. Excuse me. So our first one is called a Coup D'etat, and that is a sudden overthrow of the government. Either a strike or a blow against the state is what that means. The directory was replaced, and Napoleon Bonaparte made France the dominant power of Europe. He was put in as, the government that was created was called a consul, and there were 3 men, but Napoleon assumed the position of first consul, so in a sense that made him the dictator of France. Again, he was eventually a popular general, and if you are popular with the soldiers, you have their support, it's very easy for you to take over, to have their control, to go in and take over from the previous government. So as that new government, the consulate replaced the weak directory. So once in that position of power, Napoleon promoted trade and industry. He promised jobs to the bourgeoisie, taxed imports to protect businesses, set up banks to keep the economy stable. Peasants could keep any land that they had gained during the revolution, and some of those nobles that had fled France were pardoned and allowed back, and many of them soon held high government positions. So again, most of the page will discuss France, Napoleon, the wars that they're involved in, but Napoleon did prove himself to be one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. However, there are a few examples of where some of his decisions weren't always the best. So one thing he had created was the Napoleonic Code. So it's Napoleon's codes of law that he had created. It was a comprehensive system of laws. This was the first attempt in modern times to make such a code, and Napoleon himself thought that this creation of these code of laws was one of his greatest works, one of his greatest achievements. These ideas in these laws reflected the ideas of the Enlightenment and the Revolution. In it, all men were treated as equals. There was religious freedom, and it protected property. Classes were abolished. The government gave great support to education. And then in 1804, Napoleon was crowned emperor. So you might envision how that would happen. Actually, he became emperor in 1804. So we had this, I don't know if I have a picture of it, but a flowing robe, and walked down the aisle of Notre Dame Cathedral there in Paris, France. And the Pope was at the front. And on the pillow was the crown. And typically, the Pope would take the crown and put on the head of the new emperor or leader. Well, Napoleon got to the front, took the crown, and placed it on his own head. And that was pretty symbolic of him showing that he had more power than the church. So signal power over the church. Okay. So there were some Napoleonic Wars, a series of wars between France and most of the major European powers. Napoleon did want to eventually rule all of Europe. I about said Egypt, but I did want to mention something. During his position as general or as a soldier in the French army, if you remember back when we studied Egypt, I mentioned how they were out in Egypt, the French army doing some project, and they came across this wall. Well, they decided to tear the wall down, and if you can remember, in that wall was the Rosetta Stone, and that's what helped to decipher the hieroglyphics. So the series of wars between France and most major European powers resulted from Napoleon's desire to rule all of Europe. So many people who early on had welcomed him and supported him, and through some of those projects that he had accomplished or put forth, they first liked him for those things, but then later on they weren't very supportive of Napoleon. I had something about, I'll wait. Okay, the Continental System. So this was Napoleon's plan to ruin Britain by forbidding France's allies and any countries under French control to import British goods. So they tried to ruin them economically by maybe starving them and putting a hurt on their economic resources and the food that was coming in. But what actually ended up happening was that it kind of, in the end, hurt France more than it really hurt Great Britain. So this was called the Continental System. Also during this time, so Napoleon and France had to worry about a lot of the things in the Americas. They had sugar plantations in what's today the country of Haiti. The slaves had revolted, and they were trying to keep hold of land in the United States. And they had a large section known as the Louisiana Purchase today, where they decided to sell that land to the United States. And it was a price of about $15 million. That increased the size of the United States quite a bit. So the Continental System nearly ruined France. Britain increased trade with Spanish colonies in America. Many smugglers got around the French barricades and still helped many of the British, and they helped get food from Britain into some of the other European nations. Many merchants turned against Napoleon because this was hurting their livelihood and their economy. So on the pretext of enforcing the Continental System, Napoleon had forced the Spanish king to give up the throne, and that's a term called to abdicate, to give up the throne. And then guerrilla warfare. These are surprise attacks by small bands of soldiers The Portuguese and the Spanish were involved in this. And this was called, so let me back up just a little. There were three major things that kind of were mistakes by Napoleon. So the Continental System didn't really work, ended up hurting France. The Peninsular War, as it was called, because Spain and Portugal are on the Iberian Peninsula. The Peninsular War lasted about 5 years, and eventually France was driven out of Spain. Okay, and then the third one was, this was part of the Napoleonic Wars, was the invasion of Russia. France had taken over many nations. They had a lot of countries that were considered puppet countries. France was a puppet government to them. They controlled them. So troops from France and these conquered countries made up about 420,000 soldiers. And so they called that the Grand Army, and it was no match for Russia. So as the Russians, realizing they're no match for this Grand Army as it's marching towards Russia, the Russian soldiers decided, and their leaders, that they would retreat into their country. Again, Russia's a huge country, biggest in the world today. And so as they retreated into their country, any crops that could have been used to feed the French soldiers, they were burned. Any livestock was slaughtered along the way. So as they went into the country, the Russians carried out this, it was called the scorched earth policy, where they just left nothing for the French soldiers to help them. So as they retreated, they set fires, depriving them of food. When the French retreated, they lost most of their men. So they eventually got to Moscow, and Alexander didn't want his great city to fall to the French, and so they set fire to the city as well. And again, there was nothing for them. In late October, Napoleon decided, okay, we better retreat back, and so this was 1812. The Russians had attacked them as they were retreating. There was no food, disease, the cold Russian winter, and so when they finally left Russia and made their way to France, they had only about 10,000 men left. So Quadruple Alliance was made up of Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Great Britain, and this was to keep the balance of power in Europe. So in 1814, after defeat by the Russians and they're retreating back, then some of these other European nations took control and forced Napoleon into exile, and they put him, or sent him, to the island of Elba, which is off the coast of Italy, a small island. He was in seclusion. They even gave him a pension, but eventually he made his way back to France, gathered some more soldiers. They were not well trained, but gathered these soldiers, and again tried to take over other places throughout Europe. And this resulted in his final battle, called the Battle of Waterloo, June 18th of 1815. And Waterloo is a place south of Brussels in Belgium, the country of Belgium today. And of course, this was Napoleon's final defeat, took place in Waterloo. So then he was exiled. They didn't want to have him coming back, so they exiled him to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, so very far away from France. He was there about 6 years, wrote some of his life history, and says he died of stomach problems, possibly had cancer. So again, test on Monday, so please study, and thank you.